Dylan Carlson sat in his small Seattle apartment, staring at an old cassette tape he hadn't touched in 30 years. March 1994. The date written on it, in Kurt's handwriting, felt like it was burning through his fingers. What Kurt had recorded on this tape, nobody else had ever heard. And what happened the day Kurt gave it to him would haunt Dylan for 3 decades. But tonight, for the first time, Dylan was ready to break that silence. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of traffic outside. He turned the cassette over in his hands, studying Kurt's handwriting. Dylan had spent 3 decades protecting this secret, carrying it like a stone in his chest. Every interview he'd done about Kurt, every documentary request, every time someone brought up those final weeks, Dylan had kept his mouth shut. Not because he was hiding something shameful, but because what happened that afternoon felt too sacred to turn into content for public consumption. It was March 8, 1994, a Tuesday afternoon that felt like any other Seattle day. Gray skies, light rain, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay inside and do nothing. Dylan had driven out to Kurt's house in Lake Washington, not because Kurt had called him, but because something in his gut told him he needed to check on his friend. They'd known each other for years, moved in the same music circles, shared the same love for heavy, droning sounds that most people couldn't understand. But more than that, they understood each other's darkness, the weight that fame and expectation can put on a person's soul. When Dylan pulled up to the house, he noticed Kurt's car in the driveway. The place looked quiet, almost too quiet. He knocked on the door, waited, knocked again. Finally, he heard footsteps, and Kurt opened the door. What Dylan saw in that moment would stay with him forever. Kurt looked different. Not sick, not tired, not the way the tabloids had been describing him for months. He looked peaceful. There was a calmness in his eyes that Dylan hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. It was unsettling in a way he couldn't quite name. Like Kurt had made a decision about something, and Dylan didn't know what it was. "Dylan," Kurt said, and there was something in his voice, a softness, an openness. "I was hoping you'd come by." They went inside, and the house felt empty despite all the furniture and gold records on the walls. Kurt made coffee, and they sat in the living room, talking about nothing and everything. Music, the rain, mutual friends, the usual stuff. But Dylan could feel something underneath the conversation, something Kurt wasn't saying but wanted to. Dylan had first met Kurt back in the late 80s, when both were just kids trying to make noise that meant something. They'd bonded over their shared love of the Melvins, over their understanding that music could be a weapon against the mundane. But more than that, they'd bonded over something neither talked about much, the weight of existing in a world that felt fundamentally wrong, the struggle to find meaning when everything seemed meaningless. As Nirvana exploded and Kurt became one of the most famous people on the planet, their friendship remained constant. Dylan never wanted anything from Kurt except his company. He didn't ask for favors, didn't try to ride on Nirvana's success, didn't treat Kurt differently. That's probably why Kurt trusted him. After about an hour of coffee and conversation, Kurt stood up abruptly and walked over to where his acoustic guitar was leaning against the wall. "I want to play you something," Kurt said, picking up the guitar and sitting back down. "I wrote it last week, haven't shown it to anyone. Not the band, not anyone." Dylan felt his stomach tighten. There was something in Kurt's tone, something final about the way he said it. "Okay," Dylan said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Let's hear it." What Kurt played next would change everything Dylan thought he knew about his friend. Kurt began to play. The melody was simple, almost childlike, but there was something haunting about it. The chord progression was unlike anything Dylan had heard Kurt play before. It wasn't grunge, wasn't punk, wasn't anything you could put a label on. It was just raw and honest, stripped of all the noise and distortion that usually surrounded Kurt's music. Then Kurt started singing, and Dylan felt every hair on his body stand up. The lyrics were unlike anything Kurt had written before. There was no anger, no sarcasm, no cryptic poetry that needed decoding. These words were clear, direct, almost uncomfortably honest. Kurt sang about finding a door he'd been looking for his whole life, about no longer fighting with the mirror, about how everything he needed was in letting go, about understanding things only when you stop running. The way Kurt sang it, with his eyes closed, completely present in the moment, made Dylan's chest feel tight. Dylan had heard Kurt perform hundreds of times. In basements, in stadiums, in recording studios. But he'd never heard him sound like this. There was no performance in it, no awareness of being watched. Kurt was singing for himself, or maybe for something beyond himself. When the song ended, Kurt opened his eyes and looked at Dylan. There was a long silence. Dylan realized his face was wet. He was crying and hadn't even noticed. And then Kurt said something that made no sense at all. The tears surprised Dylan. He wasn't someone who cried easily, had built up walls over years of dealing with his own demons. But something about that song had broken through every defense he'd constructed. "Bro," Dylan said, his voice shaking. "What was that?" Kurt smiled, that rare, genuine smile that he only showed to people he truly trusted. "I don't know, man. It just came out yesterday. I was sitting here alone and I started playing, and those words just appeared." Dylan wiped his eyes, feeling embarrassed but also unable to hide what he was feeling. "Kurt, that song. It feels like a goodbye song." Kurt's expression didn't change. He didn't confirm or deny it. He just set the guitar down carefully and said, "No, Dylan, it's a hello song. I'm saying hello to myself for the first time." The statement hung in the air between them like smoke. Dylan didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to ask 100 questions. "What do you mean? Are you okay? What's going on?" But another part of him, the part that understood Kurt's need for space and silence, held back. Years later, Dylan would realize Kurt had been trying to tell him something that afternoon. Something important. Something Dylan was too scared to hear. "I've spent my whole life running," Kurt continued, his voice quiet but steady. "Running from expectations, from pain, from myself. And I just realized, you can't outrun yourself. The only way through is to stop and turn around and say hello to the person you've been running from." Dylan felt his throat tighten. He recognized that truth in his own life, too. They sat there for a while longer, not talking much, just being in each other's presence. Kurt made more coffee. They looked out the window at the rain. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only exists between people who truly understand each other, who don't need words to communicate what matters. Before Dylan left, Kurt did something strange. He went to his room and came back with a cassette tape. "I recorded it this morning," Kurt said, handing it to Dylan. "I want you to have this. Don't listen to it for a while. Just hold on to it." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Promise me you'll keep this safe." Dylan took the tape, confused. "Why are you giving this to me?" Kurt looked at him with those calm eyes. "Because you're one of the only people who ever really listened. Not to my music, but to me. You never wanted anything from me except friendship. That's rare, man. That's really rare." Dylan left the house that afternoon with the cassette tape in his jacket pocket, feeling strange and unsettled. Something about the whole interaction felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. He drove home through the rain, and the whole way, Kurt's words echoed in his head. "I'm saying hello to myself for the first time." That night, Dylan thought about listening to the tape, but something stopped him. It felt too private, too sacred. He put it in a drawer and tried to forget about it. But he couldn't forget the look in Kurt's eyes or the sound of that song. Over the next few days, Dylan tried calling Kurt several times. The phone would ring and ring, no answer. He left messages. "Hey man, just checking in, call me back." Nothing. By the third day, Dylan's gut was screaming at him that something was wrong. He thought about driving back out to the house, but talked himself out of it. Kurt needed space sometimes. Dylan knew that. He'd respect it. He didn't know he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Then came the news. Dylan heard it like everyone else, through phone calls from mutual friends, through the media, through the horrible cascade of information that changes everything in an instant. Kurt was gone. The world was mourning the loss of a generation's voice, a musical icon, a troubled genius. But Dylan was mourning his friend, the guy who made him coffee and played him a song on a Tuesday afternoon. The guy who said he was saying hello to himself for the first time. And suddenly, Dylan understood what that meant. The cassette tape in his drawer felt like it was on fire. In the chaos that followed, Dylan forgot about the cassette tape. Forgot isn't the right word. He buried it, deep in his mind, because looking at it or thinking about it meant confronting something too painful to process. Months passed, then years. Dylan moved on with his life as much as anyone can. He continued making music with his band Earth, creating those slow, heavy soundscapes that had always been his calling. But there was a weight he carried, a secret he couldn't share. The weight manifested in strange ways. Dylan would be recording and suddenly remember Kurt's voice. He'd hear someone laugh and think of Kurt's rare joy. The grief was always there, waiting to rise up unexpectedly. Dylan dealt with it by burying himself in work, in sound, in creating music. Earth's music got slower, heavier, more meditative. It was the sound of someone processing grief, trying to find meaning. Every note was, in some way, a conversation with Kurt. It wasn't until about 5 years later that Dylan finally listened to the tape. He was alone in his apartment, going through old boxes, and he found it. Kurt's handwriting on the label. March 8, 1994. His hands were shaking as he put it in an old tape deck. He didn't know if he was ready for what he was about to hear. The hiss of the recording started, and then Kurt's voice, singing that same song. But, hearing it alone, in his apartment, years removed from that afternoon, Dylan understood something he hadn't understood then. The song wasn't about goodbye or hello. It was about acceptance, about making peace with something, about finding a kind of clarity that most people never find. And Kurt had found it days before the end. After that night, Dylan put the tape away again and didn't touch it for another 25 years. But the song never left his mind. It played in his head when he was alone, when he was struggling, when he felt lost or afraid. Those lyrics became like a mantra, a reminder that Kurt had found peace. Dylan started to change his own life slowly. He went to therapy, dealt with his own issues with substances, tried to be more honest with people around him. Kurt's last song had become his guide. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden. Dylan didn't have some grand epiphany and transform overnight. Instead, it was small things. He started saying yes to relationships instead of keeping people at arm's length. He began talking to his bandmates about feelings instead of bottling everything up. He stopped using heroin, a process that took years. But he kept trying because Kurt's words echoed in his head. Everything I needed was in letting go. Dylan started meditating. During those sessions, he'd think about that afternoon with Kurt, the calmness in Kurt's eyes, the peace in his voice. Dylan tried to find that same acceptance, that ability to stop running and just be present. His music changed too. Earth's albums became more than heavy drones. There was melody now, space for beauty alongside darkness. Critics noticed the shift. Dylan never told them why. Now, in 2024, sitting in his apartment with that cassette tape in his hands, Dylan Carlson made a decision. He'd carried this secret for 30 years, and maybe it was time to let some light in. Not to exploit it, not to make money or get attention, but because maybe someone out there needed to hear what Kurt had found in those final days, that peace was possible, that clarity could come, that sometimes saying hello to yourself for the first time means letting go of everything you thought you needed to be. And maybe, just maybe, sharing this story would finally let Dylan forgive himself for not driving back to that house when his gut told him to. Dylan picked up his phone and called a journalist he trusted, someone who had covered the Seattle music scene with respect and honesty for decades. "I need to tell you about something that happened in March 1994, Dylan said. "Something I've never told anyone. Kurt played me a song, his last song, and I think people need to know it existed." The journalist agreed to meet, and Dylan knew this conversation would open doors he'd kept locked for 3 decades. But maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time. They met at a quiet coffee shop in Georgetown. The journalist, Sarah, had been writing about music since the 80s. She set her recorder on the table. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," she said gently. Dylan looked at the recorder, then out the window at the Seattle rain. "I need to do this. I've been carrying it alone for too long." He told her everything, about driving to Kurt's house that Tuesday, about the calmness in Kurt's eyes, about the song that had changed his life. Sarah listened without interrupting. "Will you play me the tape?" she asked when Dylan finished. Dylan shook his head. "No, that tape is private. That was a moment between Kurt and me, and it needs to stay that way. But I want people to know it happened. I want them to know that Kurt found something in those last days, something peaceful." Sarah nodded, understanding. People are going to ask questions. They're going to want proof. Dylan expected that. Let them ask. I know what I heard. I know what that song meant. That's enough. As Dylan prepared for that meeting, he thought about what Kurt had said. "I'm saying hello to myself for the first time." He understood now. Kurt wasn't saying goodbye that afternoon. He was saying hello to a version of himself he'd been searching for his whole life. A version that wasn't defined by fame or expectation or pain. The cassette tape sat on Dylan's desk, and he knew he'd never play it for anyone else. That song was sacred, a private moment between 2 friends. But the story of that afternoon, the message Kurt had tried to convey, that was something he could share. And maybe in sharing it, Dylan could finally let go of the weight. Maybe he could stop running too. Years later, people would ask Dylan what the song sounded like, what the exact lyrics were, whether he'd ever consider releasing the recording. He always said the same thing. The song itself isn't what matters. What matters is what Kurt was trying to say. That you can find peace. That you can say hello to yourself even after years of running. And when people pressed him for more details, Dylan would smile sadly and say, "Some things are meant to stay private." Dylan Carlson never forgot that Tuesday in March 1994. The gray Seattle sky, the rain on the windows, Kurt's calm eyes, and the sound of that guitar. He carried it with him every day, not as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, clarity can come, peace can be found. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop fighting and just say hello to who you really are. The cassette tape remains in Dylan's possession, locked away, never to be heard by anyone else. But the story, the feeling, the message of that afternoon lives on in Dylan's music, in the way he treats his friends, in the way he's learned to be present with himself. Kurt's final song wasn't recorded in a professional studio, wasn't released to millions of fans, wasn't analyzed by critics or played on the radio. But it changed one person's life completely. Sometimes the most important songs are the ones nobody else hears. The ones that exist in a moment between 2 people who understand each other's darkness and light. Kurt's final song was that kind of song. A quiet gift, a private message, a last lesson from a friend who had finally stopped running and found what he'd been looking for all along.